Call our meeting to order. And it looks, we don't have any public comment, do we? Okay, and it looks like we also don't have instructional council, assuming they didn't have a meeting. So I will move it over to you, Dr. Gorman.
So thank you, you are correct. Ms. Davis, Dr. Baker, Mrs. Williams, thank you for joining us this evening for the Academic Achievement Committee meeting. Let me just walk you through the agenda really quickly. As you referenced, there is not an instructional council update this week. There was not a meeting. When those meetings resume, of course, there will be an instructional council update. Steve Petros joined us a couple of meetings ago to really share with you how well our scholars have been doing on a previous MAP assessment. He would be doing that anyway, but that was one of the mandates that we had coming out of virtual learning, or hopefully coming out of the pandemic, where we had to present to board members on how well our scholars were doing. So Steve is back today. He is going to give you a fall to spring update to show you where our scholars were in the fall and now where they are in the spring. Before that, he is going to give you a tiered assessment overview. So we thought it was important when we're sharing these data with you that you are well aware of all the assessment that the scholars get throughout the school year. So if your constituents are saying scholars are testing too much or things of that nature, you can absolutely share with them the assessments that our scholars take every single year. And then lastly, as we made a standing item, our strategic plan connections, we want to share with you how this type of work is connected to our strategic plan. So we placed a document in this presentation so you can see the direct connection. So with that, I'm going to pull Steve Petros up to give you the tiered assessment overview and the 98B goals progress update. Steve?
Great.
Want to work that for you?
That's all right. Thanks, Dr. Gorman. Hi, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever we are. Just to kind of kick this thing off, as Dr. Gorman referenced, just want to kind of set the stage by talking about a tiered assessment system or a balanced assessment system. There's a variety of terms kind of in the educational arena to describe this, and just kind of want to give a quick overview of these different tiers that we, and nearly all districts, execute or administer within their system. And we often refer to it or describe it as a pyramid. The state assessments, the annual assessments, these are typically in the spring, April, May, consisting of MSTEP, My Access, College Board suite of assessments. These are annual summative assessments, and really their primary purpose is to provide feedback to you or to the top of the district, to the public, to policymakers, legislatures, and they kind of give a one-time snapshot of the extent to which our students are performing against these state standards. They have limited, but some, instructional value, and again, they're only administered once. In the past, probably 6 years, they are also used as part of the educator evaluation process, and so data comes up back, reports are provided by MDE, not only on proficiency or performance levels, but also as growth measures as well. The next tier of assessments is, in this graphic, it's called district. You might hear the term interim. You may hear the term benchmark assessments. And for GRPS, these tend to be the NWA MAP growth assessments that we administer 3 times a year. I will say too, we also administer the College Board assessments for grades 8 and up in fall and spring. So perhaps you could think of those as interim also. For the fall, they are, that's a local decision. We make the purchase, we administer them. In the spring, it's the same test, but it is driven by MDE. It's required for our students. And we use interim assessments just kind of like a mile marker on the highway.
It's required for 8, for all of those?
It is. The College Board suite of assessments, yep, 8 and up. It used to be, 8 was just added as a requirement a couple years ago.
Okay.
So that's a relatively new change.
By our choice to prepare students, but
Yeah.
now it is.
Yeah. So in the context of kind of MSTEP and College Board, MSTEP used to cover 3 through 8, and then the College Board would kick in. We would still offer it to some 8th graders. M-STEP now only is administered for science and social studies for grade 8, and the math and reading is covered by the College Board. So they've got a lot on their plate. The next tier is classroom level assessments. These could be anything from homework assignments to projects, weekly quizzes, unit tests, chapter tests, more high frequency. So as we move down the pyramid, it's more high frequency and more instructional feedback. As we move up the pyramid, it is more infrequent, annual at the top, and with more limited instructional feedback. So it's just kind of a high-level overview of our tiers of assessment. Dr. Gorman did use the phrase or mentioned the phrase, or sometimes the public perception or worry about too much testing. A couple of years ago, we actually did look at all of our interim level and annual assessments, not classroom level, but just kind of more of the standardized assessments. And we looked at the average testing time, and we compared that to the total amount of instructional time within a school year. The total amount of time we anchor on the number 1098. That was the number of instructional hours per school year, or at least it was a couple of years ago. And then we looked at our NWA assessments, WIDA, M-STEP, My Access, College Board, and at the elementary level, it was less than 1%. Less than 1% of all standardized tests in an academic year, less than 1% of the hours were for testing. 99+% at the elementary level were for instruction. At the secondary level, at high school, it was a little bit more, about 1.5%, but still very, very little. So although there's a public perception of so much testing for my child, when you look at the numbers, it's actually not very much at all per child, but it certainly does take up a tremendous amount of resources, adult time and resources per building.
My sense is that the concern isn't just the testing, but the stress of the stakes of the testing.
Yes,
And
the
so
emotion
that's-
around it.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
so how much of those are, like, I know MAP isn't supposed to be high stakes, but how much of those are the high stakes, like the College Boards?
Well, that's for high stakes. There's no high stakes for the kids, except for the SAT.
Yeah.
It's more high stakes for the adults, to be honest, in the context of educator eval. But in terms of time, on average, MAP tests take less than an hour per subject. So if they do math and reading.
And they're very helpful. for
Yeah,
parents,
absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. This slide just kind of shows us by name some of the assessments at the interim and the annual level. WIDA, the WIDA screener, is in the fall. WIDA Access is kind of late winterish. And this is certainly just a subset of our students, but not all. College Board assessments, as I mentioned, grades 8 and up. We administer them in mid-October and then again in April. M-STEP and My Access, kind of in that 6-week stretch between spring break and Memorial Day. And that or those are used for accountability and for the read by grade 3 law. Those are our.
Steve, before moving forward, will you unpack who takes the WIDA assessment and maybe give a little background on what WIDA is?
Sure.
I was just gonna ask.
WIDA is taken in the fall, especially by incoming students, or for some incoming students where we want to capture the extent to which English is not their first language. And there's levels that they can be assigned to, and there's tiers of support that follow that. And it's kind of similar in the late winter also. I will note too that it does also feed into the accountability system, although at a very small level, participation that is. So not much to it, and again, only for a subset of students. I'm going to keep on going for the sake of time. Interim level. While GRPS has administered MAP for over a decade, it really only became a requirement in the past 2 years since the passage of the Return to Learn law in August of 20, and the Read by Grade 3 law a couple of years before that. So there now is a compliance piece that fulfills. We administer MAP growth K-8, fall, winter, and spring. And then we also add in our freshmen and sophomores for our spring administration. We've been talking about this. We've been having these conversations here at this table and in this room for many, many years. It's probably the most popular national standardized interim assessment. It provides national norms, it provides growth measures, it provides Lexile scores that can be used by both the teachers, the parents, and the students. And it does contribute to our educator eval system. And for the past 2 years, we also do provide the results in aggregate to the state through My Data Hub. Map reading fluency is relatively new. That meets the extensive assessment requirement based on the Read by Grade 3 law. And essentially we administer it for all K-5 kids in fall, winter, and spring. It provides teachers a more granular look at how their students are doing in different domains of reading and speaking. To shift gears to Section 98B and the goals progress reporting, this is just a continuation of our conversation from, I think, early May at that time. And just to give a kind of quick review, Section 98B is a piece of Public Act 48 from last summer that requires districts to share feedback with their boards about the progress of their students, both at the middle of the year and at the end of the year. And it also requires that be done using the benchmark assessment, also defined in the law, and for which we use the map growth assessment. We anchored on a focus of growth for our students, looking at or with a goal of the 50th growth percentile for all students, broken down by grade, by subject, by subgroup. And just to kind of give a 30-second kind of overview of what growth percentiles are, students will have a growth target. So if a student takes a test in the fall, let's say I'm a 4th grade student and I have a score of 200 in the fall, according to the NWA data set, I should be at a 210 in the spring. And if I reach that RIT score of a 210 in the spring, then my growth percentile will be the 50th growth percentile. I am average compared to my national peers. If I were to exceed my growth target and actually increase my score by 11, 12, 13, 14, 15 points, then my growth percentile would be above the 50th, in the 50s or 60s or 70s, depending upon how far beyond my target I actually score. Similarly, if I fall short of my growth target, say I only increase my raw score or my RIT score by 8, 9 points, my growth percentile would probably be in the 40s. I'm just shy of my target. So the 50th growth percentile means that I've just hit my target, and if I exceed it, it's more than 50. If I fall short, it's less than 50. So we take those numbers for all of our students, our scholars, and then we calculate averages. So the top row within the table, for reading on the left, math on the right, all of our K-8 students, scholars combined, for reading, we were at around the 41st growth percentile. So on average, our students fell just a few RIT points shy or short of their fall to spring growth target. For context, when we had this conversation last month, that number was just a few percentile points higher, in the mid-40s. Similarly, for math, you can see it's 44.6. That's the average growth percentile. Again, that essentially means our students, on average, fell a few points shy of their target, not by much, but just a few. And just like with the reading, that number for math, 44.6, is just a few percentile points less than when we last met and I was sharing fall to winter growth data. So you can see how it's broken down by the different subgroups, and I'll share the next slide in a moment. But kind of the gist or the real kind of overarching takeaway from this is that on average, our students' growth from fall to spring was slightly less than fall to winter. And then number two, on average, our students are missing their growth targets by a few points. And as a result, their growth percentiles are less than 50, and slowly their percentile rank is being kind of whittled away. Not by much, just a few points here and there, nothing dramatic, but within any given year, it's a little bit less than where they started.
Question for you. When was the last time our students on average in these two categories met the 50 percentile target?
For all grades K-8 combined, it's been several years. However, by grade and subject breakdown, meaning grades K or 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 in math or in reading, we do have grade subject combinations that will be in the 50s on occasion. So for example, I'm looking at some just results. This past fall to winter growth period, I'm looking right now, I'm glancing down at 7th grade in math, and they were in the 50s.
What about third grade reading? Do you have those numbers?
Sure. For 3rd grade reading, fall to winter was 45. Actually 45 for both fall to winter and fall to spring. Now that's different than proficiency. But it's an indication of the extent to which students grew from fall to winter or fall to spring.
See, how does that compare to scholars from around the region, scholars around the country? The question was, have our scholars gotten to 50? How do we compare it to others, just kind of high level?
Sure. So there's two parts to that, nationally and locally or regionally. Nationally, because these numbers are based on national norms,
Yeah.
it indicates that our students are just a little bit shy of their national peer group. Not by much, but they're falling short a few RIT points every year as a measure from fall to spring. Locally, we don't know because that's not public data. Certainly this assessment is the most popular, certainly in Kent County, but also it probably has about 60 to 70% market share throughout the state, public and private, or public and non-public. But we just don't know how other districts, how students in other districts are doing from a growth perspective because it's not publicly available. After today, if you want, I can certainly unpack and share more details with you.
So this measures, so this is the, I think I know the answer to this, but now I'm like doing the math in my head and probably confusing myself. But so if using your example, if the student scored a 200 in 4th grade, and if that's above or below where they're supposed to be, is that their growth is still 210? Or are they supposed, so if a kid scores 205, is their growth 210 or is their growth 215?
It's a great question. It actually, the growth target will vary based upon the starting score. So if I'm that 4th grade student with the 210, NWA might have a data set of the past 4 years that has 10,000, I'm making this number up, 10,000 4th grade students that took the test in the fall that all started with the 210. And then looks at those 10,000 students and sees where do they land in the spring. And of those 10,000 kids, the average amount of growth was 10 points. Some kids might have grown 15 or 20, some might have grown 0 or 5. But on average, that set of kids that all had the same starting score of 200 grew 10 points. And then that process is repeated for every single starting RIT point. So the target is based upon other real kids nationwide that started in the same place.
So again, this is different from the proficiency. So if the kid is
Very.
above or even below, so if they're at 195 and they grow 10 points, they're at the 50th percentile.
Growth percentile.
Growth percentile, even though they could still be behind. And so those kids we want to have
Yes.
a higher growth percentile.
Yes, and the opposite is true also. We could have very high-performing kids, high-performing from a status perspective or from an achievement or proficiency perspective, and yet they may not show the same amount of growth as their nationwide peers who are also high-performing. So it cuts both ways. Okay.
There is a document or a chart that the teachers have access to, which actually shows which students in the class have, that they're doing well, but they have lots of growth. In contrast, we have scholars who may be doing well, but aren't exhibiting any growth at all. They're just kind of staying stagnant. So one of the reports, and and Steve has the more professional title that I love, is this quadrant report, which shows at the classroom level, the building level, which scholars are in the upper right-hand corner, which is high achievement, high growth, and which scholars are low achievement, low growth, and then in some instances, it's high achievement, but it's low growth as well. So we know as a classroom teacher, wow, this scholar's doing wonderfully, but there's not a whole lot of growth there. Or this scholar's doing wonderfully, and look at all the growth that's been exhibited. So I think those are some of the reports that our teachers have. And MAP data, I think you referenced it, Dr. Baker, is probably the best data because it's real time. It's really helpful for teachers. In contrast, some of the state assessments that our scholars take, or some of the college board stuff, no knock on them, it's after the fact. So we get these data in the summer, scholars go on to the next grade level, there's not a whole lot you can do about it, whereas with MAP data, you can pinpoint the areas in which the scholars are being successful or on which they're struggling, so you can make real-time adjustments in class. And that's why I'm a believer in MAP. And coming out of a high school space, Steve and I had these conversations all the time where I was probably more ACT until I had a couple of elementary school scholars in the system, and I really saw the value of MAP. Because no longer could you go to a parent-teacher conference and the teacher would say things like, wow, your daughter is doing so well. Well, what does that mean? How does my scholar compare to other scholars nationally? How does my scholar compare to other scholars in the classroom? On which areas is my scholar struggling? So it really creates a dialogue at parent-teacher conferences that we may not have had before.
They're all very good assessments, but they're designed for a different purpose.
Correct.
And as long as we keep the use or the application of the results from that assessment within the lane of its design purpose, we're okay. But when we start or try to interpret the data in a way for which it's not designed, that's when things get a bit clunky and messy.
One additional piece, if you can just go to the WIDA slide really quickly. Some schools are impacted by WIDA much more than others. So when we're thinking about scholars taking the MAP test multiple times per year, or the College Board assessment at the high school level, a school that has a tremendous amount of English learners has to also proctor the WIDA assessment to many scholars. I think of Union High School. I don't know the numbers off the top of my head, but a large percentage of scholars at Union are also taking a WIDA assessment. So those are schools where it seems like they're spending a tremendous amount on testing because they have other tests that they're mandated to give their scholars.
Yeah, in the southwest side.
Correct.
And it's really, it's a heavy impact on the adult. It is on the kids too.
Mm-hmm.
But for the small handful of adults in the building that are responsible for that work, it can really add to their plate, and it can be overbearing at times. So we need to make sure that we actually provide the appropriate resources, people, time, so that they can actually administer those tests appropriately, properly, timely, and yet also minimize impact to their other responsibilities.
And how do we determine which students have to take that?
So there
Is
is,
it pretty specific?
yeah, there is a screener, Dr. Gunnell, scholars who have to take the WIDA assessment. We have the expert here, I will let her
So,
explain it to you.
Thanks for the question. It's a great question. On the enrollment form, when I register my scholar as a parent, it has a question that says, does your scholar speak another language other than English? And that's called the home language survey. And that prompts letting us know that that scholar needs to take the WIDA. So then we start with a screener. And the screener will tell us what level of proficiency that scholar is. Once you take the WIDA and you're identified as an English learner, by federal law, you have to take the WIDA every year until you exit it out of the EL program.
Dr. Gunnell, will you speak to scoring, different levels of scoring?
So the WIDA is like, it scores from a 1 to 4. So a WIDA level 1 would be your scholar that is a newcomer. And WIDA has standards that align with the national standards. So WIDA has a framework, and it aligns with the national standards. So there's alignment. So when you get to be a WIDA 4, that's when you can begin to exit the EL program.
Are there additional dollars associated to a student that is English as a second language?
Yes, we get grant money, Title III, Section 41, immigrant money, and they all have different ways to qualify. So the big umbrella is Title III, then there's Section 41 for WIDAs 1s and 2s, and then there's also immigrant and migrant.
So it's also it also determines what funding we get then.
Correct, that's all grant money.
Just another question that comes from that then. What percentage of our scholars in a given time are going from, coming out of that? So are we tracking how many?
Yes, so every year, the WIDA window period is from mid-February to just about before spring break. And so we're still waiting for the WIDA results for this spring. It usually comes out in July. And then the state tells us who can be exited and who cannot, who's exited for the year. Depending upon the year, some years we have 100 scholars that exit, other years less. So during the pandemic, parents had the choice of whether they wanted their scholars to take the WIDA or not. Some scholars didn't take the WIDA. But this year, all scholars took the WIDA. Because the state looks at your percentages of WIDA taking. And so that goes also into, so you want to have the highest percentage, like 99%, if not 100% of EL students that take the WIDA.
So just like you're being monitored for accountability with MSTEP, same for WIDA. How many scholars, Dr. Gunno, would you say on average take the WIDA assessment from the Grand Rapids Public
So
Schools?
25% of our scholars are ELs, and so we have to administer the WIDA.
Like 4-ish, 4,000.
About 4,000 scholars, 25%, yes. And they range in WIDA 1 through 3 and 4. And as you know, it takes 5 to 7 years to become proficient in a second language. So it depends on where you come in the spectrum. I mean, usually scholars that are younger learn English much faster than when they come in at the high school level with no, especially when they're not reading in their own language. Because you only learn how to read once, and you transfer your skills from your first language to the second language. Tendency for a scholar that comes in high school to learn English, it becomes harder. But we know that as adults, right?
Yeah, if you wait till your 50s, it's even harder.
So
It
are all
can be
the,
done.
are all the WIDA assessments in English?
WIDA is in English. It tests language proficiency. There's a speaking part, and then there's also a written part and a question part. They have to answer questions. It's all in English. So the goal of the WIDA is to find out how students are not how, if they're learning English and if they're progressing.
So how does do our Southwest kiddos take that then?
The Southwest scholars that are EL students, so at Southwest you have both native English and native Spanish speakers. Those scholars that are native Spanish speakers take the WIDA.
Okay.
So the native English scholars would
they don't
not.
need to. Okay.
Any other WIDA questions?
No, but that was wonderful.
Absolutely.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, Maya. Appreciate it.
Thanks.
Thank you, Myra.
Just maybe to the demographic slide, I don't know if we covered that, if you want to talk about that, and then we'll switch to strategic plan connections.
Sure. So this is just a breakdown of the mean or the average student growth percentile for these subgroups. Again, thinking back to where we were, when we had this conversation with this, or a similar slide, just last month. The numbers in general tend to be about 2 percentile points lower than they were for fall to winter. So not by much, but we did experience a little bit of a slide for the fall to spring growth period. And if after today you want to see more details by subject, by grade, by any subgroup, we have all that easily available right here. And I can share that with you
Absolutely.
through Dr. Gorman or anybody else.
So the next slide, just to show you the connection, we have of course, our larger strategic plan document that I believe John Helmholt showed to you. And what you will notice is there's a tremendous emphasis on ELA and mathematics. And what you're seeing here are 5th grade GRPS performance on M-STEP and ELA and math. So this is M-STEP, this is not MAP. This is our test that we take 3 through 8 and 11th grade that we've talked about before. This is the state test that we're mandated to take. So I want you to notice 2 things. These are pre-pandemic data, because you'll see the 2018, 2019 there. It really doesn't make a lot of sense at this point to put in your strategic plan the pandemic years, because you had 1 year where 50% of our scholars tested, essentially voluntarily tested, and then you had other school districts in the region that didn't require any scholars to test. Also look at the 8th grade data, and Steve referenced how there was a different assessment. So one might look at this document and say, wow, look at that spike in ELA from 25 to 43.1. It was a different assessment. So Dr. Baker, when you reference that PSAT piece, the College Board, that's where you'll see some upticks. So you can make some inferences from that. Was one test more complex than the other? I think that's worth digging into. But you can see, regardless of what data we show you, we're not where we want to be. And if you look to the right, you're also seeing that scholars are not achieving at the same rate. You're seeing differences with groups of scholars, but you're also seeing socioeconomic differences. So essentially, students who come from lower SES households are underperforming scholars from higher SES households. And you're also seeing that students from different groups are being outperformed by others from different groups on the document. Sorry for that redundancy there. But not that this mirrors what you saw before, but you can see it is pretty comparable. So our job over the next 5 years, because strategic plans are usually in effect for about 5 years, to make significant improvements in these particular areas, both ELA and mathematics, as well as ensuring that these data change so that all groups are growing and there are not as many differences among the groups of scholars who attend the Grand Rapids Public Schools.
Has there been any discussion as to what it is about the economically disadvantaged students that are kind of keeping them in the subpar standard versus the non?
Sure. I think if you look at national data, it will mirror our data as it relates to those 2 particular groups. Some might make inference as it relates to, access to navigating systems, knowing based on your household, is there someone who can get resources, whereas there another family member who maybe has to work multiple jobs. So I think there are some inferences that we can make, but ultimately we have to dig deeper. And if we are truly about equity in our system, we need to provide resources to the scholars who have the least resources, those who are furthest from the goal. So we have to continue to do that in our school district. I think we can all make assumptions or inferences around families that have more wealth than others, but I think it boils down to, for us, we know we are serving about 85% free or reduced lunch scholars, so we have many scholars in this situation. About 15% of our scholars do not qualify for free or reduced lunch, even though we're a 100% free lunch district. That said, we still have 85% of our scholars who are in poverty.
We do have some other reports and data sets that show how GRPS schools buy free reduced lunch rate compared to other schools statewide. And so Ron used the number 85%. So if there's a specific school that has an 85% free and reduced lunch rate, we can look at some reports at 20 other schools, 40 other schools across the state that are at the same free reduced lunch rate, and how are our students performing relative to others in the same place based on FRL. And we have many, many, many schools in GRPS that are outperforming other schools across the state based on the same free reduced lunch rate. So relative to, like a similar profile.
Yeah. There's a tab on myschooldata.org, and we also have our school data, where you can essentially create peer districts. So instead of comparing our school district to maybe one that's right around the corner with different student populations, we can click peer district and it will show how we compare to Lansing, how we compare to Kalamazoo, how we may compare to other like school districts. So for a future presentation, that may be something very valuable to you to see how do we compare to peer districts, right? And it's relatively easy to access. It's all transparent data. myschooldata.org. You can put in your school district, click on a peer district, and you can essentially see those results.
Will you have access to see what programs or supports they have in place that may differ than what we have?
Sure. I think we'll have to do some homework there to figure out, and I know that our administration has many connections around the state to see what programs are being used. 40 minutes from here, we've discussed this before, Kalamazoo Public Schools for a summer intervention gave all of their scholars books to read for the summer. What they saw as a result of that intervention, giving all of their scholars summer books to read, was those students outperformed their traditional summer school. So if you notice that within our ESSER funding, we are putting a plan together, we shared it at the Board of Education, where all scholars throughout the district will have 5 books of their choice that they will get every single year to start building their libraries. So that's just one example of something that a neighboring school district is doing. I think the highest effect size right now that supports getting scholars out of the challenges that they've experienced coming out of the pandemic is high dosage tutoring. So the more adults that we can get in front of our scholars to give our scholars feedback that is timely, that is based on criteria, I think those are some of the things that we need to put in place. The unfortunate thing about tutors is there is a teacher shortage. There's also a tutoring shortage, but we have many institutions of higher education around the Grand Rapids area, so might that be one area to look to get folks who can support our scholars, and also many resources that we have as a school district.
Yeah, I feel like, in the time I've been on the board, that the diagnostic tools that we have at our disposal are, so good and so precise compared to kind of a sense of where kids were at. And so when I said earlier that the MAP tests are very helpful for parents, so I remember going to, and I get the RIT score, right? And if my kid, then I'm like, okay, so then I get on the computer and figure out, well, what are books in the RIT score? And then I go to Schuler's Books to look for books that are in that range. And then I come home and argue with my son about whether or not he's going to read books at his grade level, which she doesn't. But the fact is, though, is that those are resources. So to some extent, this is very helpful data, and especially if our numbers are 85% economically disadvantaged, certainly we want our non-economically advantaged students to have a good experience, but almost that data ends up becoming not really very relevant. It's what we do with this other. And that was for families that don't get those resources. How do we, in high dosage tutoring, books in the summer, those are the resources that are gonna make a difference. It's just that we have to get that. So the teacher knows which kids aren't performing or growing at the level that they need to grow. It's that does the teacher have what the teacher needs to make sure that those handful of kids, because it's got to be a relatively small number, get to that growth level by the spring.
I think there's some basic questions, so to speak, that we should be equipping our parents with when they go into parent-teacher conferences. You're giving me a RIT score, what does that mean, right? So like RIT is Roush unit, right? But that doesn't mean anything to anyone, right? You like that?
That was
Mr.
really
Petros?
impressive.
Right, so,
What does the I and the T stand for?
It's
so
the
now you're
I-
tripping
it's
me
the-
up.
It's R for Roush.
Roush
it's
and then
the
unit.
IT at the end of unit.
Very good.
You quizzed me on that at a park party many years ago. So again, what does that mean? So if you give a parent a number, well, okay, my scholar has this number. What number should my scholar be at the particular grade level in which they are in, right? What is a Lexile level, right?
That's the
That one you were referencing about the books going to Schuler's. I have this particular Lexile level. So I think there's some basic questions that we can with which we can equip our parents when they go in, so it makes that parent-teacher conference very meaningful. Because it can be very overwhelming. And I also think that some of the interventions that we provide through MAP can also be overwhelming at times, right?
Well, and also helping them know where they can get the resources. I mean, if a parent goes in now and knows what questions to ask, but doesn't have access to the resources that would help, then
And
it's not.
And some of the tier 2 interventions that Eric and Jonathan put together with our team during intersession, that was very differentiated. So during intersession, it wasn't here's a general curriculum, it was these are specific skills on which your scholar needs additional supports. And I think that we can get to that place where we're focusing on individual scholars and not everyone as a whole, that's when we'll be successful.
I'd also be interested, we talked about finding peer districts, but I'd also be interested in seeing if there's schools that stand out as having more growth or,
Sure.
and seeing if there's anything that they're doing that's different. As far as like, I know there's some schools that have wonderful community partners where there's lots of volunteers and things like that.
So I think there is a book called It's Being Done. And I believe the author is Chenoweth. Don't quote me, but I think that's correct. And it examines 12 high-poverty schools across the nation and some interventions they put in place for struggling scholars that made them essentially overachievers or outperforming peer districts. I believe it's Chenoweth. It's being done. I may be off on the author.
Well, and even, I'm thinking even in our district, I bet there's certain schools that
Well,
have-
we have had schools throughout the years that have outperformed other schools in the district. And what we've noticed about those schools is that they have really meaningful professional learning communities where you bring in both third grade teachers, they're talking about lesson planning, they're examining student work, they're noticing, well, my scholars are doing wonderfully on these particular content areas, my scholars are struggling. So what we've noticed is there's a tremendous amount of instructional coaching, a tremendous amount of focus on really instructional leadership, professional learning communities. So essentially what is getting monitored gets done. A continuous cycle of school improvement is happening in those buildings. But we have had some outliers throughout the years where two schools are serving similar scholars, but achievement is significantly higher in this particular building. We've seen that throughout the years. And that's why we need to have consistency in the entire school district. Anything else?
Well, I'm just thinking about this, so there, we have parent university, and I'm sure that has an impact as well, parent involvement. And so I'm wondering if we have considered about that, as you said, that community learning, about extending some of that support to the parents through parent university. So there is a parent university in Atlanta, and they actually come together to work to bring the parents up to speed as well, so that they can be that support to their children. And so I would just admonish us to consider that type of option, because we do know that that parental support is important, and it actually helps. So we do have this parent university. Maybe there's some things
is.
there that we can kind of tap into.
Yeah, absolutely. It is, our parent university is a phenomenal resource. And many of the things that we're talking about, how to know if your scholar has enough credits to graduate, how to interpret a transcript, how to ask the right questions in parent-teacher conferences. You know, those are some things that we are absolutely addressing in our parent university. I know Mel's here now, he's nodding, but I think we do a really good job with that, but there's always room to do better.
Yeah, I would, like I said, this particular one, I've had the pleasure to sit in on a few of their meetings where they're sharing, and they are actually helping parents kind of learn some of the content.
Absolutely.
So that they can support their students as they go through. And so I'm just wondering if that's something that we might consider, again, because we do know that involvement from the parent really translates to our scholars.
Another path that we've dabbled with in the past is partnering with the Grand Rapids libraries. Our office has partnered, for example, with the Granville Ave Public Library, and we would hold parent sessions there as well, working with parents to go through how to interpret reports, talking about Lexiles, and doing it in a library setting where they're surrounded by the books. We would help kind of guide them move from the student report to choosing text, fiction and nonfiction, that aligns with their students' Lexile needs.
Any other questions?
One quick foreshadowing note with respect to state assessments, since they're on the screen right now. We anticipate receiving embargoed results from our state assessments in late July or early August, and then the embargo will probably be lifted in late August. So at that time, we can then start having conversations here around state assessment results.
All right. This concludes our presentation. Thank you.
All right.
All right, I did want to see if you guys were okay with canceling the July meeting, because it's on the calendar right now.
Well, if we can require Ron to be here, then we can.
I can come in as an audience member if you like.
Give public comment. I've been gone 3 weeks and I haven't seen half of those test scores. Sorry, I hope that wasn't on camera. If you could edit that 4-letter word out. So,
So you just let us know, of course, Eric Harmson and Jonathan will help coordinate upcoming meetings.
And then is there anything that you want on the agenda for August? Or you can always email it to me, but.
I'm still hoping to see more information about the plans for student supports.
Student sports?
For around, I kind of keep bringing that up, and
Okay.
and I'm hearing about the summer program, but I mean we have those ESSER dollars. I'm hoping that we can really be a bit more intentional about how we get our students the help in real time when they need it, and not just at summer and the breaks.
Sure.
So I would like to really hear about kind of what our plan is for fall to have them, real time getting some help and supports as they go along. And I'm not sure what our numbers are gonna look like with regards to COVID, if we're gonna go back into quarantine or any of that stuff. But I think it's important that if it looks like those numbers are upticking and we have these periods of quarantine, that we have something in place so these students don't feel like they felt the last 2 years like they are dying when they come back to school because they can't get all that work done. That we would have some type of kind of quarantine catch-up that they can come into so that they can get back into their studies and be on track and not be behind and feel like, oh, yeah, I don't even want to try because I'm never going to catch up.
I think following up on that, I think that with the ESSER funds especially, and also strategic planning, is that we've been looking at data like this forever. So what has the strategic plan and or ESSER funds doing that's new that we can point to that these are additional new efforts that we're doing to take it? Because we're always trying to improve these scores, and we spend the ESSER money but we often don't know exactly how it relates to the planning. So just again, we have a new strategic plan, we have ESSER funding, we have a pretty strong analysis overall of where the problem areas are, what new things are we doing to address it. So I think that fits in what
Then,
saying.
Ms. Davis, the Schoology survey.
Oh, that's right.
We
Yep,
talked
Schoology
about
and
that.
Seesaw, yeah.
Talked to Jonathan. Mike Hastings has those data. They'll be available in August if you decide to cancel your July meeting.
Okay.
Good with waiting till August, when would that be?
Be back to
You'll be
the
back to your
first
normal
week,
schedule?
I think it is, yeah.
First week of August.
Correct.
Which would be
Yeah.
the 3rd.
Yes. How do you know that?
I know when the 2nd is. That's why.
Want to do 4th?
All set?
Okay, yeah.
Thank
meeting
you.
adjourned.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.